Hello, my name is Sue Linderman, and I'm pleased to be back with you again for part 6 of our 6-part video series, an exploration of some lesser known aspects of our country's history. Our purpose in this class series has been to enhance our understanding of racism in America by exploring the history of our country that we didn't learn in school. Much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or even hold are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy. Understanding this history gives us a foundation for action to address the profound inequities that exist in our society today. So let's continue. First, I want to thank you who have been with us for some or all of this 6-part series. I hope it has been meaningful for you and that it will lead to action. While education is necessary, action is critically important. So today, we're going to focus on the future, to use our deeper understanding of our history to shape our future actions. But first, a brief recap of video number 5, voter suppression, then and now. We looked at the legal history of voting rights in the United States, beginning with the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution and its amendments, and then various actions by Congress and the courts, including the Supreme Court, that has shaped voting rights in America even to this day. We revisited the 15th Amendment and the end of Reconstruction, 100 years of voter suppression tactics between 1865 and 1965, with a focus on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Shelby v. Holder Supreme Court decision in 2013 that resulted in the current assault on voting rights by way of voter ID laws, registration roll purges, and the limitation of resources in certain minority precincts. So the question is, where do we go from here? And so the first question is really, what have we learned? What is it that we didn't know before? And how does this history affect us? How are we different as a result of what we now know? What do we see differently? And finally, based on that, what is it that we need to do, each of us individually, collectively in advocacy groups, and collectively as a society? And do we indeed feel a greater sense of urgency to act now that we know where we are and how we got here? So I'm going to ground us in some definitions. There are varying points of view on the defining characteristics of each of these words, but for our purposes, we look at the term prejudice, an unfavorable opinion or feeling formed beforehand or without personal knowledge, thought, or reason. White supremacy can be defined as the belief, theory, or doctrine that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial groups, especially Black people, and are therefore rightfully the dominant group in any society. Now, we're all familiar with the term white supremacists and with seeing the tiki torch carrying, armed, angry citizens declaring their authority, their white authority over all other peoples. And when we use the term white supremacy more broadly, we're not talking about the violent white supremacists, but we're talking about a belief conscious or unconscious, that white people are inherently superior or Black people are inherently inferior. And probably many of us would strive to say that we don't believe that. And yet each of us carries some unconscious bias, implicit bias, and we'll talk a little bit more about the source of that. But manifestations of this belief in white supremacy show up in things like an assumption, a presumption that white people are competent. A white person is competent and needs to demonstrate that they are not, accompanied by a presumption that Black people are not quite as competent and need to demonstrate that they are indeed competent. And quite frankly, there are circumstances where when a Black person demonstrates that competence, an unspoken, perhaps unconscious reaction is, wow, that was, yeah, you're different. Degrees of reactions in that regard. And we're going to talk a little bit later about examining our own beliefs and prejudices and what we do with them. Racism, for our purposes, is the prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized. And importantly, for our purposes, particularly as we have reviewed American history, is that racism is a system of prejudice plus power. And we have seen how so many of the institutions in our country are deeply racist. Now, the question has arisen sometimes in the past, can a Black person be racist? In my perspective, and using this definition, a Black person may be prejudiced against whites, may be angry with whites, may feel very strong antagonism toward white people, but there is no Black system of power that exists in the United States that turns that personal animosity into a racist system. So what we're talking about here is the white power that has been exercised throughout our country's past. What have we learned? Well, starting in 1619 with the arrival of the first kidnapped Africans on our shores, we have learned about the creation and maintenance of the institution of slavery in our country up until 1865. That created an underclass of people in our country. And then following the end of the Civil War and the dismantling of Reconstruction, we learned about segregation in our society manifested in laws and custom that perpetuated white supremacy. And then we moved on to the 20th century with additional public policy in housing, in education, in benefits, in the criminal justice system, in voting, that disadvantaged Black Americans at every turn. So how does this history affect us, Black and white people? There is so much we never knew. Now, in regard to the racist nature of our country, I would propose that we white people learned more that we didn't know, and that many Black people participating in this class knew aspects of our history that remained invisible to many white people. And so you have to ask, why did we not know this? Why was this history not taught? Well, I would propose that history is written by the victors. And the victors in this circumstance are the white people writing the textbooks and teaching the curriculum in our schools and colleges. So this legacy of segregation in public life and in housing has led to isolation, one from another. There are statistics that show that 75% of white Americans do not have a single Black close friend. And so if we white people are missing that personal knowledge, then what's going to fill the vacuum? And it is the stereotypes, it is the messages that we hear. And those stereotypes are a function of both overt and subliminal messaging. I took a class probably 35 years ago at DuPont called Developing Effective Black-White Relationships. And it was focused on a group of white managers in DuPont. We were the target to be educated. And in this group of 18 or 20 white managers were also 2 Black DuPont employees. They were not managers. In fact, they came from 2 DuPont plants, manufacturing plants, most of which happened to be in the South. And the facilitators explained to us that the reason for including the Black DuPonters in the group was that when they, as the outside facilitators, described the way things are, and we white DuPont managers said, well, not in our company, not in DuPont. The Black employees were there to bravely, courageously speak up and say, if true, it is this way in DuPont. And I will never forget the African-American man who was in the group explaining to us at one point in the course that the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan held its monthly meetings in the conference room of the plant, the DuPont plant, where he worked, at the invitation of the plant manager. And it was a stunning revelation. It seemed almost incredible, and yet it was credible indeed. Now, when the 2 facilitators of this class, African-American men from San Francisco, began the program, they said, we want to be clear that this is not about guilt and blame and shaming. The reality is you cannot have grown up in the United States of America in the 20th century and not be prejudiced, because we have been bombarded with spoken and unspoken messages about the inferiority of Black people in our society. Many of those messages not based in truth, but messages nonetheless, and ones that we heard and absorbed, even unconsciously. If you're not familiar with Jane Elliott, who was a teacher in Iowa in the 1960s, who arranged to have a documentary made of an exercise that she did with her class of 5th graders, declaring that brown-eyed or blue-eyed students were inferior. I suggest that you look it up. You can find the video as either The Eye of the Storm or Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes. And one of its prevailing messages is that even without overt statements, prejudice and discrimination against another group of people is readily heard, internalized, and acted upon. One of the profound things that happened in that class that I took very early on, the facilitators asked the white managers to list all of those descriptors of Black people. And they had chart pads that they were going to fill out with what we had to say. So what adjectives would you, or terms would you use to describe Black people? And there was a rather long, uncomfortable silence. And finally someone spoke up and said, exotic. And everybody nodded. And then jazz, and musical, um, athletic, talented, and then it kind of petered off. And then the facilitator said, "Oh, sorry, that we didn't give you um, accurate instructions. We need to clarify what we were asking you for. We want to ask you, not what do you think, but what have you heard?" Well, we filled 11 chart pad pages with terminology that was overwhelmingly pejorative and negative. Lazy, stupid, criminal, murderer, rapist, drug addict. It was staggering. And as this was going on, and as they moved to the next part of the class discussion, I'm looking at those 11 sheets of paper hanging on the wall and thinking, what must it be like to leave your house every day and go out into the world and know that the people that you meet, the people with whom you interact, have many of these ideas about you when they don't even know you? What burden is that to bear? It was revelatory. I was changed forever by that experience. And so these stereotypes, these phrases, these beliefs affect our attitudes. It's been shown multiple times that on job applications, if the identical resume, the identical application is submitted, but one candidate for the job has a Black sounding name and the other has a white sounding name, that affects the likelihood of the person being contacted and invited in for an interview. And these examples where stereotypes rear their ugly heads and have direct impact on the lives and capabilities of individuals, there are a zillion of them. The other thing that comes about as a result of this isolation and this lack of knowing one another is that white people lack a fundamental understanding of what it is like to be Black in America and what kind of empathy that knowledge could conjure up. Oftentimes when there are cross-racial discussions of individual experiences, as a Black person will describe the things that they deal with on a regular basis, the white listeners can become very emotional and very sad and very apologetic. And it's important to say in those circumstances, honey, this is not about you. You need to listen. You need to hear. You need to absorb. You need to understand, and then move on from there. I have a very dear friend of decades, someone that I met at DuPont, who currently lives in South Carolina. And he grew up very poor, but ended up going to college, getting a degree, working for DuPont in a professional capacity, and is a wonderful guy who gives back to his communities wherever he's lived in a variety of ways. He has shared stories from his earlier years of being stopped repeatedly for driving while Black. All his life, he had wanted a fancy car as he was growing up. And after he started working for DuPont, got married and had 2 kids, he bought a Jaguar. It was his pride and joy possession. But if you were a Black man in America, particularly then in the 1970s, driving a fancy car, you were presumed either to have stolen it or to be a drug dealer. And so he was stopped numerous times, spread-eagled across the hood or the roof of his car up against the the windows of his car, sometimes with a gun at his head. And the terror he felt, particularly being stopped at night on dark roads, was chilling and has stayed with him every moment of his life. And now, today, at about my age, he describes the fact that there are days when he gets up that he just doesn't want to leave the house. He just doesn't want to put himself in the position of experiencing what he is likely to experience every day. There's a book by an author, Austin Channing, called I'm Still Here. And in it, she describes numerous experiences that she has had in dealing with white society. I commend the book to you. It's a little slip of a book, but it is a powerful way of hearing what someone else's experience has been. So what do we need to do? And a lot of this is collectively offered to all of us, Black or white, Hispanic, Asian. What do we as individuals need to do? We need to continue our education about one another. But specifically to white people, in the case of this racism in America that we have been exploring, one of the things that we need to do is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay. In fact, it's necessary. It's growth. It is not a Black person's responsibility to educate a white person about these issues. We start by educating ourselves, by reading, by watching videos, by listening. And then we seek opportunities for dialogue. And that dialogue back and forth has benefits to all of us, regardless of our race. Opportunities to share our thoughts, our questions, our knowledge, and to listen for understanding, not for rebuttal, not for excuse, but for understanding. And the somewhat uncomfortable, frequently not employed self-examination. Not easy. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then move to action. What needs to be done? And what can I do? In terms of education, there are numerous books, videos, articles, and in-person opportunities, classes like this and others. If you haven't been to the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., I strongly urge you to go. Maybe not right now because of the coronavirus, but as soon as you have an opportunity. It is a 3-story collection, display, exposition of the history of Blacks in America, African American history. It starts on the bottom floor with the Blacks who originally came from Africa and leads to the top floor and the current day. It's a powerful experience. You cannot do it all in one visit, but it is impactful, powerful. I commend it. As I said, there are myriad numbers of books, but some of the ones that I would recommend are America's Original Sin by Jim Wallis, which traces much of what we've covered in our classes in this video series. There is a really compelling book by Ta-Nehisi Coates called Between the World and Me. It is an essay written to his adolescent son. explaining the world from his dad's perspective and offering guidance and love to his son as he becomes a man. It is a beautiful piece of work. I've mentioned already in this class series 2 books by Carol Anderson, White Rage and One Person, No Vote. Waking Up White, for those of us who are white, is really an excellent book by Debbie Irving, and it includes lots of exercises for us to do to kind of put ourselves back into where were we when we figured out we were white. And I think that it also has some potential benefit to Black readers to get another side view to really how far we white people have had to come. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander focuses on mass incarceration, and it is a really powerful exposition and expansion of much of what we talked about in our video number 4. Just Mercy is a book by Brian Stevenson, who's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and an amazing person who has worked his whole career after getting his law degree from Harvard University on helping wrongfully imprisoned people find justice, and also combating the racialized death penalty application in America. The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste are 2 books written by Isabel Wilkerson. The Warmth of Other Suns describes the personal journeys of 3 people making their way through the Great Migration and the impact that that has had on their descendants. And then her most recent book, Caste, which I confess to being 2/3 of the way through, describing racism in America, not just as discrimination, but as part of an intricate caste system in our country. And then going way back to the period of the Civil Rights Movement, James Baldwin is a powerful writer. And the first of his works that I would commend to you is The Fire Next Time. I'm sure that there are others that you have read. It will be wonderful as we have opportunities for discussion and dialogue to share either our experiences with these books or recommendations of others to read. There is no end to those that are out there that will help to educate us all. There are some recommended videos that I would suggest. Deconstructing White Privilege is a video by Robin DiAngelo, and I think she does an excellent job of encouraging white people to take a look at the privilege that we hold. If you go to TED Talks and search on Talks to Help You Understand Racism in America, it will bring up several dozen videos. And then you can pick from those and see which one or ones speak most directly to you. This year, a former NFL player, Emmanuel Acho, actually played for the Philadelphia Eagles, has created a series of up to now 9 videos that range from about 8 minutes to about 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes. And he's entitled this series, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. Some of them he's done on his own. Most of them he has had other people participating with him. I would recommend you start with number 1 and work your way through the series and give particular attention to the information that Emmanuel is sharing. I think they add a great deal to our edification and our learning. All you have to do is Google Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. It is a series of YouTube videos. There is the film documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay. The recent video on the life of John Lewis, Good Trouble. The movie with Michael B. Jordan, Just Mercy, which takes some of the characters and situations described in Brian Stevenson's book by the same name. And then there are 2 videos on the Central Park 5. When They See Us is a 5-part series, again by Ava DuVernay. And then the Central Park 5 looks at the same case from a slightly different perspective. And again, there are many, many other videos, and I hope that you will share with one another videos that you would recommend. Some articles for your consideration: The History of the Idea of Race by the American Anthropological Association. And the important message here is the idea of race, because there is no biological genetic basis for race. It is a cultural, societal, sociological construct. And the history of the idea of race shows how, why, and when it developed, and the power that it continues to have. The Equal Justice Initiative has produced 3 books, actually, paperback books: The Montgomery Slave Trade, Lynching in America, and Segregation in America. You can read these online by going to the EJI website, or for $2 a piece, you can order them and have them mailed postage free to you. They are beautiful books, powerfully illustrated with important messages. So I commend those to you. And then, if we look at the issue of reparations, a US congressman introduced a bill to establish a reparations commission every year of his term, multiple terms, but no action ever took that proposal out of committee. And so there has been no meaningful study of reparations. And of course, when some people think about reparations, they think, oh, send a check. Well, no. And Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an article in The Atlantic in June of 2014 entitled "The Case for Reparations." And it is a powerful exposition. It's long, it's compelling. So I hope that you will read that as well. Having done this personal education and having it continue throughout our lives, then there is the need for dialogue. And some of this is just personal. What happens is you're having a conversation with a neighbor or a friend or an acquaintance, or you're in a group. It is important to speak up. And I particularly address this to white people, although it can apply to everyone. When you're in a situation where someone expresses a racist comment, what do you do? Sometimes it feels like we've been caught off guard, and yet in reality, we encounter these situations a lot. And so one of the things that can be done, particularly now at the end of this series, is to share what you've learned. Another thing to do is to practice what you would say. I had a boss once who said the best thing that you can do is determine a course of action, quote, out of the heat of battle. So it's not when you're confronted with a situation, but it's when you are still calm before the conflict arises, that you think through what would you do or what would you say. So you might respond, that's not my experience, or I don't agree, or I don't agree with that. It's a better response than I don't agree with you. I don't agree. I don't agree with that. And perhaps that might lead to more conversation. Maybe it stops it dead in its tracks, but you are speaking up so that silence doesn't mean agreement. You could say, well, actually, and then provide a fact, something that you've learned either here or through other sources of education. You might say, well, I used to think that, but I learned something else. Or I read this or I saw that, and I found it really informative, or I found it really helpful. So ways to engage when inappropriate and inaccurate comments are made. Dialogue in book groups can be really powerful. So join a book group, perhaps one that focuses on racial or societal issues. Form a book group for that purpose. And if it's a more general purpose book group, suggest one of these books for the reading and discussion by the people involved. Join or form a discussion group. The YWCA is renowned for offering opportunities for discussion groups, cross-racial discussion groups. They are going on right now in many cities, and I recommend that you look for those and find a way to join one. And then use those and other opportunities to create cross-racial relationships. Again, there may be some discomfort, but hey, discomfort is part of growth. Let's do this. And as we do, let's listen to one another. Listen for understanding. We talked about self-observation, self-examination, excuse me. And this begins with sort of observing ourselves, stepping outside ourselves and sort of watching us as we're interacting with other people, doing things. Do we observe ourselves doing or saying things that in retrospect, we wish we hadn't? And so what about that reflection? When something happened and you did or said something that you wished you hadn't, or didn't do or say something that you wished you had, reflecting on that. Why did I do or say what I did? Why didn't I do or say what I didn't? And in the course of this, as things come up that we wish we had done differently, monitoring the reaction that we had. What triggered us? And how did we respond? And how might we have responded differently? It means being self-aware, being intentional. And I share with you an experience that I had just a couple of years ago. After all this work I've done, after all this learning that I have, after all these relationships that have been created and nurtured. 2 years ago, a giant pine tree, 50, 60 feet high, fell on our house. It did some significant damage to a limited portion of the house, but as it was resting and needing to be removed, the potential for additional significant damage was quite real. And I saw the crew show up, and I saw the workers as they began the difficult job of removing the tree without doing more damage. And I was sitting in the living room when I heard this horrific crash. And I thought, oh God, no. And I looked up through the window, excuse me, and I saw that the crew chief was white, and I felt better. And in looking at my reaction, thought, oh, Sue, seriously. So these messages are embedded in us. We will likely never get rid of them, but we can reshape our responses when they come to the surface by being thoughtful, by being intentional, by being aware. And one of the best things to do in this regard is to engage a partner, someone who where we can call each other on reactions or responses or emotions, a buddy system to help with our individual and personal growth. So then further with regard to action, It's important to realize that the system can only be changed by the people with the power. Now, the demand for change can come about from a variety of sources, but the decision to change comes from those with the power. And white people have the power. So choose an advocacy group that has meaning to you and work in partnership with people of color. That way, we make much more meaningful progress, we develop more meaningful relationships, we get to know one another as human beings. There are many advocacy organizations already in place, many multiracial advocacy organizations focused either on legislation or on policy. So figure out which of these profound inequities you think needs your energy and attention, and get moving. Make your voice heard to organizational leadership, call your representatives, write your representatives, write letters to the editor, make your voice heard. And consider making personal reparations. Patronize firms that hire returning citizens. There are those in every community, firms that explicitly help ensure that people who have been incarcerated, as they seek a return to a productive life in society, have an opportunity to get a job and make a living. Find out which firms in your community have adopted that policy and patronize them. Patronize Black-owned businesses, Black-owned restaurants, other organizations. Contribute to or volunteer with Black-led organizations. While the power structure is overwhelmingly white, it doesn't mean that white people only talk to and work with ourselves to get things done. And we don't need to be in charge every single time. So as we close this series, I share with you what got me off the couch. This list could be so much longer, but I read the names: Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Stephon Clark, Botham Jean, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Antoine Rose, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. These are people who paid with their lives for the racism that is endemic in our society. And there are hundreds or thousands more. This has been going on forever. But it has been the explosion of cell phone ownership and usage and the videos that have been captured as a consequence that have made these travesties visible to all of us. I liken it to the period of the civil rights movement, when the photograph of Emmett Till's corpse, or the video of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or the images of people screaming at the Central High School 9, or the heartrending, heartbreaking view of little Ruby Bridges, brought to the country's consciousness just how evil racism is in our society and how much work is needed. So, as is our custom, as we come to an end, I offer some discussion questions if you're in a group, excuse me, Or if you're watching this by yourself, something for you to reflect upon and then potentially discuss with friends and family members and neighbors. Consider what in this class had the greatest impact on you. What actions will you take as a consequence? What commitments will you make so that this is not just a one-time deal? And what would be helpful to you in taking action, in being different? We've learned more about the inequities and their foundations in our history. And now it's up to each of us to educate ourselves, to get involved, to act. Please feel free to contact me at this pretty simple email address if there's anything that I can do to help you in our shared journey. Thank you again for being here. I hope we have an opportunity to gather together again at some time in the future. Thank you.